we just talked about the radius configuration, and now I want to move on and do the LDAP or Active Directory authentication. Going back to our configuration. Before we go in depth into the LDAP configuration, there is on the Cisco website, there is a very good configuration example about syncing it with LDAP and Active Directory. So in this case, on the same place where we find the iSCSI boot example, we also find the Active Directory configuration example. And as I already explained last week, all the options that you have here are available. So in my case, I went to Cisco UCS Manager configuration, so the support page for the UCS Manager. And there you find configuration examples. And in those configuration examples, we see LDAP and Active Directory. Now, if we go here, you immediately see how you should configure your Active Directory server. So that's very good as well. So let's say we need to create a special user and all kinds of stuff. So in my case, I configured a certain a very basic Active Directory configuration. And what we can focus on here is how you exactly configure LDAP authentication, and especially related to Active Directory authentication, because there is some special configuration necessary that is always the same in every setup, but it's still something that you need to be aware of. So first of all, we go to our Active Directory server, which is this guy, and here we have our server, and let me create an OU for that. New OU, UCS, and in that container I'm going to put my network user, so I'm looking for what it told me here, the Active Directory server. That's not that one, what I was looking for. So in this case, what we need to configure is authentication. So I created an organizational unit called UCS in my domain. My domain name is datacenter.ccie. So those are some things that I need to be aware of, and these will be given to you when you step into the lab exam. So do not be afraid to know exactly how you need to know about LDAP paths and stuff, how they relate to each other. Probably you will be given the bind user and all kinds of other things that you need to set up for your LDAP authentication. In one of our mock labs we already do this, and we just give you the whole list of topics that you need to configure. So just like here, I will configure my LDAP authentication based on what I know from my Active Directory, but in the lab you will be given this. You will be given a list of settings that you need to do. So I first need to log in with the admin user, because I'm now logged in as a read-only user, so that won't work. I launch UCS Manager again. And I say I do native login because I do not want to do radius, and I'm just going to use the admin user. Then we go into Ldap, and there are some things already configured, so let me quickly delete that. All right. So again, same configuration step as we would do with Radius. We start with configuring a provider or a Radius or an Ldap server. And in my case, my Active Directory is the Ldap server I'm going to be talking to. So there are a number of fields which are very critical for our deployment. First case, what is the IP address of the domain controller? Again, this will be given to you. Now there are some things that we need to do. The bind DN is a special user in Active Directory that we use to allow the authentication to be done with. So if we go back to our examples here, so configuring the UCS, it will tell you an example of how to configure the bind DN. So the bind DN is my user, which is CN is, let's use bind user, I think it's called. Bind user. Which username is UCS bind. So the username here is UCS bind. The OU it is in is called UCS. Then the CN is data center. CN is CCIE. This should be my bind DN. DC are the last ones. DC. Again, probably this will be given to you. You do not need to know. Incorrect, it should be OU and OU. Why is that? So to find the DN for the role, this should be the format, right? So it's CN is the username, OU is the container it is in, then DC and DC for the domain. So that's what I configured here. So UCS bind in the OU for UCS, DC is data center, DC is CCIE. That is my domain name. Then the base DN that I'm going to use is actually this. So every user will be based out of this OU. This OU is configured like UCS. Now we need to configure here, so the password is the password for the UCS bind user. Again, will be given to you. And I need to match these, of course, which I do. And I need to specify the filter, which is very important. So when configuring here in the local authentication, the filter that I need to configure is that I need to configure exactly which Ldap attribute I'm looking for and which Ldap attribute I'm placing my username in. And the user ID $ here is the variable that Cisco UCS is using. So in my case, I add this to the filter. This is a good thing to remember. They could assume that you already know this. They will not ask you an Active Directory domain structure because this is not a Microsoft test. You should not know this. You do not have to know this. So they will give you this, but they can ask you to configure the filter. And I showed you where you can find it. So it's SAM, so SAM account name. It's not a very difficult one to remember, but it's very important. So this is the information that I need. Next, do I want to do group authorization and do I want recursion? I do want to enable group authorization, meaning that I can authenticate based on the group of users. Recursion, do I have a group in a group in a group? No. This will be given to you as well. So what do they want you to enable here? This is related to how the Active Directory is configured. And the member of attribute, that's okay. You do not need to change that. So we configured our Ldap server. This was the most difficult part. Then, of course, we need to create a provider group. So we say Ldap PG. We place our server into the provider group. And that's basically what we need for the authentication. So now we can start creating a new domain. Create a new authentication domain. We call it Ldap. And we say, I authenticate to Ldap, or let's call this Active Directory. And we authenticate it towards the Ldap PG. The Ldap PG is the server that we just configured. And so we now can start using that. Now we're not done. There's still one more step we need to do, and that is authentication or mapping of group users to certain groups. So if everybody who's logging in right now will be a read-only user. That's not what we want. We want to map certain Active Directory group names to certain roles inside of it. So I cannot configure Active Directory to send an attribute, right? So like in Radius, I can just configure send this attribute to this server. But in Active Directory, I need to set this group of users can be in this role or has to be in this role. So I need to make group to role mappings. And that is done with Ldap group maps. So Ldap group maps are what is your group Ldap name and to which group does this match. So I configured a group called, let me check again. I configured a group called UCS network, meaning I want to have network settings for UCS network. Let me use another user, by the way, because I used network user earlier. User network. So instead of network user, I'm going to call this user network. I'm going to add it to UCS network. There we go. And I'm going to tell, right, what is the group name? Now, a lot of people just configure the group name here and think they're done. But I need to specify the whole container. So instead of just typing the group name, I need to type the full Ldap name. So CN is UCS network. Then my OU is UCS. DC is, that's UCS, right? Yes, UCS. Then DC is data center. DC is CCIE. So this is the full group name that I need to specify. So basically put your base DN behind it. I have a bind DN and a base DN I just configured. The bind DN is the user that I use to authenticate the users. And the base DN is really the group that I start looking in. But for group mappings, I need to specify this path fully. So I just need to fully specify this path. And I say I match this to the networking configuration. So everybody in the group of UCS network, let me check again if it's called UCS network. Yes, it's called UCS network. Everybody in this group can access or change all kinds of network settings. So this should be good to go now. I configured my Active Directory authentication using this provider group, and I configured a group mapping. So logging in through a certain user should check this group mapping. And my remotely authenticated user is gone, so I can use any user here. Now let me close my UCS manager again. Clear out the Java cache, just to be sure. All right, clear the cache. Revisit the website, I'm not taking any risks. Launch the manager. Run it. And again, I do not see my Active Directory authentication. This is getting frustrating. Clear the cache. Revisit the website. So it just takes some time to get this change processed. Let's see if it is there now. Still not. I'm wondering why this is, but I configured the group and I think I configured the CLI of the FI. What we can do, we can see that. So we can see if the domain that I just configured, if that is in the CLI. Still not there. Let me just do the clearing one more time. And while we wait for the manager to boot up, we will check what happens. The only tool you have is trying the authentication. So it's trying, can you log into the system? So that is going to be your verification. Can I do successful authentication to Active Directory? So there's no real check there. This is getting silly. So let's check if we properly configured this. So we configured authentication domains, and one of them is called Active Directory. It's using Ldap, and the Ldap is using a certain provider group. So that is all configured. The native authentication is still there. The radius is there. So configuration-wise, it looks fine. We configured some roles. We configured group mappings. Within the provider group, we see that we have a server. And the server is configured. The filter is configured. The attributes remain empty. The password is blank here. But it is set, so that's good. So this is very strange, why it's not showing up. Let's try and check the configuration, but probably this will just work. So let's check the CLI of the UCS and see if the configuration is actually applied. We cannot check a lot of things here because it is a very GUI related thing. All I can do is show configuration. and check for begin Ldap. Here it says the realm is configured, the authentication domain is configured. So everything looks good configuration wise, at least it's in the configuration. Let me just one more time delete the cache. All right, go into manager again. That's too fast. It's still not there. I really don't know why it's not showing up here. It has to do with some kind of caching or configuration wise. Now what would be funny if I would change the radius provider group? It's so stupid. Why it's not showing up? Because I configured it properly. It is configured like it should be. So let's change the radius configuration and set that to Ldap as well. Maybe that would change something. So I'm just changing the radius domain right now. So let's see if that helps. And then I'm just gonna move on. Launch it. So still only the radius one, but I'm using user network is what we configured. Let's see if that logs in. Authentication failed. Network user. Failed. Why is it failing? The bind user is properly configured. UCS bind. For some reason, I'm not allowed to log in. By the way, it does show that my Ldap authentication is working now with the radius group. So it might be a mapping failure right now. So the providers it's UCS bind is the user. That looks fine. Let's try it one more time. No, I'm not getting in. Let's skip this for now. I'm assuming that my personal Active Directory authentication is not working perfectly. To show you, the configuration is good. I just used the guide here. So bind DN is filled out, base DN is filled out. Ensure the filters are set and stuff. So in this case, I know for sure that my group rules and stuff, everything works okay. Or at least copy and paste the value saved from any server. Yeah, the configuration is okay. It's just strange